Well, I thought we'd sit for about half an hour, so a little more than last time, and then I'd talk a bit, and then if anybody has any questions, I guess after we sit, maybe it'd be great if anything comes up, if you have any questions about the posture, if there was something uncomfortable, if there was something extra comfortable, maybe we can talk about it then, and then I'll talk a bit, and then we can talk about. I think the subject of my talk is going to be something like, what is enlightenment anyway, or something like that. So we can talk about that. That might be fun. So anyway, in terms of sitting, here's what I'd say. Everyone looks pretty comfortable, which is great. I would say so try and allow your back to be upright and relaxed, particularly your neck. Sometimes it's difficult to figure out what to do with your neck, but I would say there's a way that your neck can sort of flatten a little bit at the back. Your head, it's as though not so much this part of your head, but maybe this part of your head was sort of heading towards the ceiling, right? Maybe, yeah, right. This part right here. And naturally that allows your face to fall into this sort of vertical posture. You notice, I've talked about this before, but you can notice the way if you bounce your chin a little bit, you can notice the way there's a sort of platform of muscle around here, around your jawline, that that wants to be. You can kind of rest your chin on it. If you yank down too hard on your chin, it starts to feel uncomfortable, right? So, and then in terms of the position of your head, if you let your chin kind of rest on that platform of muscle and you move your head back and forth, you'll notice that there's a detent right in the middle. It's like your chin locks into place right in the middle. That's how you can sort of center your head. And then when you do that, and your shoulders are kind of in line with your ears, and the energy in your shoulders is sort of out and down, what happens is that it can feel like the skin and surface muscles on your back are kind of falling down towards the base of your spine, and can be pretty relaxed, actually. Again, eyes should be open, downcast. The gaze should be soft, and my sense is that if you just do that for a while, your eyes will settle in a place where they're not jumping around the room looking at stuff. They're not really focusing in an intentional way on anything. They're just taking in the light, the patterns, and the well, we were talking about this last week, this structure of your visual system. Teeth and lips both shut. Tongue resting gently against the front roof of your mouth. There's a funny thing about shutting your teeth. I find sometimes if I do that, there's a lot of bounce. It's like my jaw is jarring slightly, and then sometimes it's as relaxed as can be. So just to pay attention to that. What is that? So I'll ring the bell now, and then we can, maybe I'll talk about a few things in the middle as well. primary request in Zazen is always to be sitting. Just to say, whenever you're present, to be directly forming the posture as though it's the first time, the first moment that you sat down. To be in sort of intimate detail, noting and framing the relationships between the parts of your body, the way the breath interacts with the posture, the way it contributes support and relaxation. And then also, when you discover that there's some part of your posture that seems like it might be misaligned in some way, or it seems it might have slipped or something, to pay attention to that, to note it, to really dig into what it feels like. And then, if necessary, make a deliberate adjustment. That's the process. And to be engaged in that process as continuously as possible is the heart of Zazen. What that doesn't say a lot about is the mental disposition that goes along with it, right? The way of meeting the thoughts that arise, the emotional tags that arise with them, and so on, right? But except for one, I would say kind of important detail, the request is exactly the same. And in the Buddhist literature that analyzes subjective experience, the output of the mind is considered in exactly the same light as the output of the body. And they're not distinct, actually. In fact, they're totally entwined. The important detail is this, right? So if you're in a state of sort of broad receptive awareness and you're noting the position, sort of allostatic comfort level and so on of your body, you'll notice that this thing happens where your attention moves from perception to perception in this really smooth and utterly natural way, right? Maybe you hear something, the mind goes to it or perceives it, picks it up a little bit, and then puts it down, right? That's all. If you have a twinge in your hip, you note it because it has this significance, right? So you perceive it, it lands in your awareness. There's maybe some attention to it, some mental formations that arise around it. But generally speaking, those particularly sensations that are mild or not alarming or something like that, they come and go tremendously smoothly. The difference between that and what happens when a really juicy thought comes up is obvious, right? When a really juicy thought comes up, your attention switches over to this other mode where that thought and its descendants and the emotions that arise along with them are the sole focus of your attention, or almost the sole focus of your attention, because that's the way we're built. And so to work with that is to make use of the cyclical nature of that phenomenon, and to be open as much as possible at all times to the actual experience. And when you're not open to it so much because you're lost in thought and your attention is elsewhere, it won't be long before your attention returns to your body and to the ability to actually both be thinking and aware, and to really dig in there, right? To really settle there and notice as much as you can possibly notice. Acknowledge as much as you can acknowledge. And don't struggle. That, in any case, is the request. don't you make yourself comfortable, whatever would do that. I'm going to sit Seiza for a bit, I think. So how was that? And did any questions arise? Was there comfort or discomfort? Anybody have any anything to report or request or complain about?
Thank you for the pointer about the teeth.
Yeah.
That was, I was noticing that the whole time, like the bounciness.
Yeah,
was
totally.
Really helpful. That was the thing I hadn't put my finger on before.
Right.
But was like tracking that.
Nice. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, it really is fascinating. And like I said, I mean, often I just wonder if it's how caffeinated I am or something like that. Yeah. But sometimes I sit down and it really is hard to do. And sometimes it's just like, so relaxed, right? And then there's, because I think there's a lot of, I think we put a lot of energy in our jaw for some reason, right? So yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's good. Anyone else? So I grew up in Marin and kind of was in my naive but formative years in the 60s, basically. And my parents weren't exactly hippies. They were more like the couple in Mad Men, right? They were, working and raising a family, and they, and in particular my dad, were also, like really into excited about the kind of explosive growth of Asian thought in the Bay Area, basically, and and other places in the U.S. and Europe, and they were also way connected with the kind of tail end of beatnik culture and the human potential movement. So they spent a lot of time early on in Esalen doing 17-hour encounter sessions with Fritz Perls and all that sort of thing. When they did that, we were looked after by this guy named Jiafu Feng, who came to the U.S. Came from a kind of wealthy Chinese family to be a banker, and he hated being a banker, and so he decided he was going to become a Taoist eccentric, and he sort of rocketed off and became a Taoist eccentric, and managed to kind of make a name for himself. And he and his wife wrote at the time the most impressive version of the Tao Te Ching, translation of the Tao Te Ching in the world, right? It was this coffee table book with his really kind of incredibly beautiful calligraphy and her incredibly beautiful photographs and a kind of, substantially newer and different translation than a lot of the other ones that had, been kicking around previously, and so on. He moved to New Hampshire and eventually continued his life as a Taoist eccentric. But the main point of all this is that we were, as kids, surrounded by people who were talking about the way and about enlightenment, right? We knew Alan Watts and like Murphy and all those other people, and they were, honestly, the brief of Esalen Institute when it started out was, you've probably heard this, it was the Manhattan Project of the mind. they were planning on inventing some mind bomb that would explode and blow up all of American society and turn it into something different, right? And so there was just a lot of talk on, breakfast, lunch, dinner, cocktail parties, et cetera, around that, right? And in the middle of it was this word enlightenment, which people bandied around just really kind of a lot, right? And as a kid, I kind of got this impression. There's one last little story that we used to know this this North Beach beatnik guy who had a I forget what it was now. Maybe he was a Fiat Spider or something like that. When he'd managed to get a really early vanity license plate that said Satori on it. Right? Like, how many people since then have tried to get Satori, but they're like, no, you can't have it because this guy got it in 1967 or something like that. But anyway, so the impression you got as someone listening to all this talk was something about how you could somehow produce this experience, or make yourself prone to, or something, this experience that would completely rewire your mind and fix it so that you never had to worry about being human again. You could be human in all the good ways and none of the bad ways for the entire rest of your life, right? And I have to say that sounded pretty appealing, and it certainly was appealing to pretty much all the adults in my life, and they sat around and talked about it endlessly. And after I talked about this in my, I sort of gave this way-seeking mind talk the first week, but after leaving home and ignoring all that stuff for 20 years or so, I decided I'd better go back and start up Zen practice. And I still had that idea, right? And I still pursued that idea in all these different ways, which over time I came to realize were kind of nonsensical and didn't really and nonsensical in exactly the sense that they didn't really make sense if you understand the whole picture of what it feels like what it is to be human, to live a human life, right? And one of the places to examine the ways in which that is true is to look at the ancient Chinese Zen literature, essentially, that talks about this. And I is in preparation for this talk, I opened on my phone, I opened my copy of the Blue Cliff record and this koan collection, and did a word search for enlightened, right? And it's got a lot. It's got a lot of occurrences, and if you search for enlightenment, it has just as many, right? So it's like every section of the book, reference after reference after reference, right? And and every individual koan in the book, reference after reference, and even if it's not part of the story that's kind of central to that section, right? It invariably shows up in the commentaries or the poems or something like that go along with it, right? So it's a good place to examine other ways of looking at this thing that in the translation into English of this literature is talked about as enlightenment, right? When I think last week, I gave a talk about how by the time Mahayana Buddhism was fully developed and had landed in China, and actually it seems pretty clear to me that part of the development of Mahayana Buddhism was exactly because of its landing in China. Right? A lot of the texts that are central to Mahayana Buddhism some of them at least, and some of the really important ones may in fact have been written in Chinese initially. Right? There's a big fight about that, but in any case, it's hard to separate their Chinese expression from the development of Mahayana Buddhism. Let's put it that way, right? If you look at how that finally landed, both in China and more specific, or Chinese Buddhism, and more specifically in Zen, right? There are these two. There are these two sort of central experiential and philosophical qualities that Zen kind of holds up, right? One is conventional cognition and the conventional notion of human effort. Right? So study, sort of programmatic practice in the sense of picking up some set of things to practice with, and maybe even a list or chart of things, and moving through them, right? That sort of thing. And there's a lot of one of the ways of looking at that whole literature is it's essentially a bunch of debates, right? And so there's a lot of debating in words mostly about what it all means and how to move through it, basically, right? So that the conventional cognition, conventional understanding, and the conventional notion of effort, right? And on the other side, there's this assertion that reality is fundamentally ungraspable. It's beyond our grasp, and it's both complicated and messy and so deeply interconnected that none of the concepts, categories, and programs that you develop over here have any definitive or independent sort of self nature. They're all just provisional, right? So those are the two things that Chinese Mahayana Buddhism holds up, and in particular the Zen School holds up, right? And there's this idea that somehow it'd be easy to get the idea from reading the literature that somehow Zen Buddhists are deprecating conventional understanding and effort, right? But that's actually totally not true. They're just engaged in the middle of it all the time, right? And even though they say, oh well, you shouldn't make too much out of the the teachings, the sort of classical teachings and stuff like that, they still read all of them, and their discourse reflects the way that the words and phrases and ideas that are contained there just roll off their tongues so easily that they were just totally steeped in them, like a bunch of tea bags, basically, right? And so they hold up conventional cognition, understanding, and effort, right? And again, they hold it up against this other sort of counter force, and the idea is you kind of smush them together, right? and live with both of them at the same time, right? And what you come to realize with practice is that those two things are conventional cognition, understanding, and effort are completely tangled up with the ungraspable nature of reality. They're and ungraspable nature of experience, right? You can't pull them apart, right? You experientially can't pull them apart, and also philosophically you can't pull them apart, right? And to be fair, the philosophical underpinnings of Mahayana Buddhism say exactly that. The Heart Sutra, which again is one of the texts it's the most popular text in Zen Buddhism, and it's very likely that it was originally written in Chinese, right? And it basically goes through the entire list of sort of what at the time were sort of modern Buddhist teachings, and says essentially, oh, these are bullshit. It sort of guts them one after the other, right? Not because you should somehow forget about them or something, but because because to rely only on those things is to think that you can rely only on those things is a mistake. And on the other side, to think that you can rely entirely on just being, floating in a sea of ungraspability is also a mistake. You can't do that, right? So the second koan in the Blue Cliff record, maybe I already mentioned this one, but this very famous Zen teacher Jiaozhou is saying, so basically you can't stop from making categories, picking and choosing, liking and disliking, all the rest of that sort of thing. So can you actually like, he says, he uses the word preserve. Can you preserve anything or not? Does any of this stuff that we're talking about here stick? And he has this exchange with a monk who stands up and says, well, what do you preserve anyway? And Zhao Zhao goes, yeah, I don't really know either. And he says, okay, so since you say you don't know, how can you say you haven't, you're not, how can you say that you're not you're not clear, at least on something, right? And Zhao Zhao says, go sit down. Stop bothering me, right? I mean, that's a very loose translation of the exchange, but basically, what he's pointing to is that this territory, this domain, the space in between our conventional ideas and our not knowing is where we have to work all the time. Basically, that's the domain of practice. And when you practice in that way, and you don't have to do it while you're sitting, you can do it while you're walking around, you can do it while you're, I don't know. I spent a whole afternoon trying to fix my house. You can do it while you're fixing your house. It's a matter of doing the thing that we do in Zazen, which is to say, attending to what's actually going on in the body and staying close to that as a model for how we work with mental activity, right? If you do that kind of continuously, you start to have these experiences, right? And everybody who's meditated for a while and maybe done, sometimes it helps to do a little bit of intensive practice, maybe sit longer than usual or something like that, but that's not necessary, right? Everybody starts to have these experiences where something surprising happens. And I guess what's worth noticing, if you kind of read through the Enlightenment stories in the literature, there's a few different modes of this, right? One is something surprising happens, like there's a story in which this guy goes to see a Zen teacher, and he's kind of all full of ideas and sort of hard to talk out of them. And they finally the guy says, "I mean, you should stay the night here. Let me give you a lantern. You can go, find yourself a place to sleep." There, he probably said, there's a bedroom down the hall or something like that. He lights up one of these little candle lanterns and hands it to him. And just as he's handing it to him, he blows it out, and the entire room is dark, right? All of a sudden. And so he's looking at this light, reaching out to grab it, and all of a sudden it's dark. And it was such a surprise that something shifted, right? There was this moment in that tangle between the conventional and the ungraspable that registered with him. And so he presumably they lit up the lantern again, and he goes off and goes to bed, and he wakes up in the morning and burns all his books and says, "I'm out of here. I'm never gonna be a scholar again. I'm just gonna go around and be a Zen student." It's not clear that actually happened, but in any case, that's the story, right? So sometimes it's surprise, or there's another great story that's a surprise in an interaction between people. There's also a number of stories about there's one about a Buddhist nun who went down to the river to get water. She scooped up water out of the stream in a bucket and was running up, and she noticed that the moon was reflected in the water, which is kind of great. And the bucket was old and flimsy, and as she was looking at the moon and the water, the bottom fell out of the bucket. And she wrote a poem about it. But it was so surprising, and kind of that experience of having the moon fall out of the bottom of this bucket was so kind of riveting that that she had a moment. But there are other ways for that to happen. My experience is that one of them is if you pay close enough attention to your kind of activity of conventional understanding and the conventional notion of effort, you start to see what a burden it is, right? What a burden the sort of calculating, holding up goals and pursuing them, and that happens on multiple different levels, and we do a lot of it, right? Et cetera. It starts to feel heavy and in some ways vexing, right? And eventually, it occurs to you that you can put it down, and you just do, right? And that's also a form of enlightenment. It has this feeling of relief and surprise and delight, right? And usually after a moment or two, you pick it up again. But nonetheless, you've had that moment where you put it down, and you can see how the world is a different place when you put it down. And then I would say the last sort of, well, I'll say one more kind of thing that shows up a lot is there are a number of cases in the literature where somebody actually gets talked into being enlightened. So there's this great story about these two guys. They were kind of, companions. They traveled all over China and studied with various teachers. And one of them was kind of one of them was pretty mature as a practitioner, and the other one was one of those people who were constantly kind of, both, sort of acting out and acting all Zen at the same time, kind of not particularly happy with their lives, right? And at one point they're snowed in the mountains and they can't go anywhere. And so, and what the older guy, the guy that sort of knows what's going on, was just kind of lounging around, and the younger guy was sitting, staring at a wall and being really, really intense. And finally, the older guy says, "Come on, man, give it a rest." And he says, "But I'm not at peace. I'm uncomfortable." And so he says, "Okay, fine. So let's talk about this. Tell me tell me everything that you think you know about practice." And the guy says, "Well, when we were studying with this guy, maybe it might actually even be the guy." No, it's a different guy. I was going to say it might be a guy that's mentioned in your earlier story, but I don't think it's the same. But I was studying with this guy, and he said this thing to me. I had this kind of moment of surprise, and the older guy says, "From now on, never think of that or mention it." and he goes through the whole list of things that he thinks he knows, right? And finally, his elder, Dharma brother says, "Don't you get it? It has to come out of your heart and cover the whole world." And at that moment, he completely got it. And he was like, and so apparently, according to the story, he's like bouncing around this little cabin in the mountains, totally covered with snow, going, "God, right," and stuff like that. And he went off and he became this really kind of famous and incredibly accomplished teacher, right? Which is great, right? But in some ways, his friend just kind of beat him down and argued him into being awake, right? So those experiences happen, right? And the truth is people have them even if they've never sat a moment of zazen, right? They might not notice them and they might not be looking for them, but they happen, right? You can have moments of surprise walking around in the world. You can have somebody tell you something that has powerful significance, such powerful significance that it I mean, we have words for this. It literally blows your mind, right? These are experiences, right? And that's good. And they're over time, if you collect some of them, they paint this picture, this sort of broader picture of what it's like to be human, which is lovely, right? The risk, and this is kind of important, right? The risk is you have one and you're like, okay, that was it. I'm here, right? And you spend, the next year or two clinging to it, and that doesn't help, right? The request is to have it, to appreciate it, and like everything else, just put it down, right? And see what happens next. What time is it now? Yeah. So does anybody have any questions about that, or can I expand on some parts of it further, or what do you think? What's the story? That's okay. Yeah, don't worry about it. Yeah, of course.
So basic terminology question. Like each of those little moments, is that kensho?
Okay, that's a really great question. I think that yeah, when people are talking about kensho, that's the kind of thing they're talking about. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then the model is like you have enough kenshos and they aggregate into satorias, and that's stable.
Well, so my sense of it is that you have experiences of kensho with various kind of various levels of sort of transformative power. Sometimes they're really just they really knock you out, and sometimes they're subtle, right? And I mean, my experience is that the subtle ones, kind of come with become more noticeable with longer practice, just because it takes a while to notice them, right? But nonetheless, right? So the model that I've sort of noticed and settled on is that you have these experiences over time. Again, you settle enough so that you realize that you're always playing right at the edge of that experience, right? And that it sneaks up on you a lot, right? And in ways that are not aren't necessarily startling, but sometimes are, and that are sort of relatively continuous, right? And that the request is to integrate that way of experiencing the world that is living in the tangle between the conventional and the ungraspable, right? Into the middle of your everyday life, right? And when you do that, you learn some things about the nature of effort and and how to apply the precepts and so on. And in the end, well, the five ranks say, in the end, you just go home and sit by the fire. That's what it says, right? And you give up on the dream of the remarkable, or the tyranny of the remarkable life, right? So it doesn't ever become permanent, right? It's always a matter of actually enacting that practice of attending to the widest possible field in each present moment, or the widest perceivable field in each present moment, and giving it its due, and allowing the energy and information that's alive in the present moment to guide you around what to do next, basically. And that practice in itself is being awake, is enlightenment, right? Anyway, that's what I'd say. There's no question that those experiences are helpful, because they paint a picture of what of the possible, right? And maybe of some corners of the experiential world that you would never have noticed or been exposed to any other way, right? But anyway, yeah, something like that. But it really is just about continuous practice.
It seems over time that those two are less separate.
Yeah, man, is that ever true? Yeah, that's right.
The extraordinary happens, but sometimes it's more ordinary.
Yeah.
And the everyday conventional stuff fits better with that, so they aren't two separate things anymore. It's much more, I'm in the stance between them.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, the conventional, from the point of view of conventional cognition, well, I mean, so there's a few people talk about this, right, in the literature, and Dogen talks about this as well, is that when you're in the mode of conventional cognition and you're really tangled up in it, that other experiential mode is invisible, right? Because, and everyone experiences this. I mean, like sometimes when you're sitting zazen, when you're really tangled up in thought, you're not hearing, you're not seeing, you don't feel your body. Because the conventional cognition and the notion of conventional effort, the conventional notion of effort, are incredibly riveting, and we're built to experience them as riveting, right? They drag all our attention, right? But you're right. What happens is that barrier actually it softens up, it gets squishier, it gets more transparent. Finally, it kind of goes away, right? And the attention can move smoothly between thinking and not thinking, between effort and no effort, et cetera, without kind of really making a big deal out of it, right? Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And the thing that aids that breakdown of the barrier is, first of all, sitting practice, and second of all, standing up and walking around practice, right? Yeah. So anyway, something like that. And and always your greatest ally in that is your body. So if you can stay with the body, you're staying with the assertion that most of your experience arises directly out of your body, right? And and that staying broadly connected that way helps soften up the imperatives of your sort of self narrative and so on and so forth, right? Anyway, does that make sense? Or, yeah.
And it was one of the hacks I had. If I would just pay attention to the feeling of my body,
Yeah.
then that would get me out of thinking on it.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. I mean, the funny thing is that it's possible to be completely in the body and to be experiencing the world as this sort of broad, you know, without painting it up too fancy. It really feels like it's just full of light, right? And kind of great, and at the same time be thinking, right? And the funny thing is that for me anyway, and that usually happens if to me if I've been sitting a lot, like 13 or 14 hours a day. I have to work pretty hard. but when you do that, the mind takes its place in this broader field, or the kind of your conventionally cognitive engine. And my experience is that it kind of floats around. Right? It's like, oh, there it is over there. Oh, no, it's over here. Right? But it's just a component, and a noticeable component, but a component of the broader picture of what it is to be human. Yeah. And when you're in that mode, this is the way I experience it anyway. A lot of the emotional drivers that run our conventional cognition are these cultural constructs that they often have an underlying physiology, but most of what we glue onto the top of that is cultural constructs that arise out of our personal experience, out of the demonstrations that we pick up early on about how to feel from our family and all the rest of that sort of thing, right? And they have those things have a powerful imperative when you're in the middle of conventional cognition and effort. But actually, when you broaden the field, the drive of those emotional tags doesn't go away, and you don't not feel it, but man, is it softened up, which is great, right? And so what it means is that the story that you're telling yourself, that the kind of current moment in your self narrative is not the only thing in the world. It's just a piece of it, right? And it has a noticeable tag, but there's another kind of emotional baseline in the mode of not knowing and so on that acts as a counterweight to that, basically. And I would say, and it's not just me, but I would say it's kind of like unconditioned appreciation for life. So what Dogen says is, he says, Zazen is the Dharma gate of repose and bliss, or ease and joy. It's translated a couple of different ways. And he kind of means it. And it turns out that it's true, right? So anyway. What else? What time is it? Well, should we go drink some tea, or what do you want to do? Yeah, it's great.
I have a weird question for tea time.
Great.
Yes. It's a good question of quantity.